What if I told you that the greatest victory in history didn't just happen on a wooden cross, but deep in the darkest place imaginable? For centuries, Christians have repeated the story of Jesus dying and rising again, but hidden between Friday and Sunday is a mystery that has divided the church, shaken theologians, and sparked countless debates. Did Jesus actually go to hell? And if he did, was it to suffer, to preach, or to conquer? The answer could completely change how you see salvation, death, and the battle that turned the entire universe upside down. Most of us grew up hearing the same version of the Easter story. Jesus is betrayed, nailed to a cross, breathes his last breath, and is placed in a tomb. Then, on the third day, the stone rolls away, and he rises in glory. That's the part everyone knows, the part celebrated in church services every year. But what about the time in between? Those silent hours from Friday evening to Sunday morning often get skipped over, almost as if they didn't matter. Was Jesus simply lying still in the grave, or was something far more powerful happening behind the curtain of death? When you read the Bible closely, hints begin to appear. There are passages about him descending to the lower parts of the earth. There are lines about him proclaiming something to imprisoned spirits. There's even a phrase in one of the most ancient Christian creeds that flat out says, "He descended into hell." These clues force us to ask, what really happened between the cross and the empty tomb? For many Christians, the story ends with the burial and picks back up with the resurrection. But if you pay attention to Scripture, you see shadows of another story, one of movement, action, and victory in places our eyes can't see. Imagine the grave not as silence, but as the opening to a battlefield where eternity itself was being settled. If Jesus didn't simply rest, if he entered the very domain of death, then what he accomplished in those hours is just as important as the cross and the resurrection. This question matters because it shapes how we understand the depth of his sacrifice and the fullness of his triumph. It's not just about whether he went to hell, but about what he did there and why it matters for you and me today. One of the earliest and most famous summaries of Christian belief is called the Apostles' Creed. It's been recited for nearly 2,000 years across denominations, languages, and continents. In it, Christians affirm their faith by declaring what they believe about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And tucked right in the middle of the creed is a phrase that has stirred endless discussion. He descended into hell. Those 4 words have carried more weight and confusion than almost any other line in the creed. Some churches read it every week and take it at face value, believing that after his death Jesus truly went to hell. Others skip over the line entirely or interpret it differently, saying it doesn't mean hell in the way most people imagine, with flames and torment. To make it even more complicated, the word hell in English doesn't fully capture what the early writers meant. In the original languages, the word used is closer to Hades or Sheol, which weren't necessarily places of fiery punishment, but rather the realm of the dead, the shadowy underworld where all souls were thought to go after death. This means when Christians of the early centuries said Jesus descended into hell, many of them weren't picturing him being thrown into flames. They were picturing him stepping into the realm of the dead, the unseen place that held humanity captive since the beginning of time. The creed, then, wasn't simply saying he died. It was declaring that he went all the way down to the very depths of death itself. But if that's true, it opens up an even bigger question. Why? Why would the Son of God, who had already suffered on the cross, enter into the darkness of death's domain? Was it part of his mission? Was it symbolic? Or was it a literal moment in history where he stormed into the underworld itself? The line in the creed doesn't explain, It only leaves us with a mystery that Christians have been trying to unravel for centuries. To make sense of this mystery, we need to step back and look at how people in Jesus' time understood death and the afterlife. In the Old Testament, the word most often used is Sheol. Sheol wasn't described as heaven or hell the way we think of them today. Instead, it was seen as a shadowy place beneath the earth where the dead went. It wasn't filled with fire and punishment, but it wasn't a joyful paradise either. It was more like a silent waiting room of the dead. The Psalms often describe Sheol as a pit, a place of stillness where no one praises God and no voice is heard. But Jewish thought developed over time. By the days of Jesus, many Jews believed Sheol wasn't one single place, but had two sides. The righteous were thought to rest in a place of comfort, sometimes called Abraham's bosom, while the wicked suffered in torment. We see this idea in Jesus' own parable about the rich man and Lazarus. In that story, both men die. Lazarus is carried to Abraham's side, a place of peace, while the rich man finds himself in anguish. They can see each other, but a great chasm separates them. This picture of the afterlife is key to understanding what it might have meant for Jesus to descend. When his body was laid in the tomb, his spirit didn't vanish into nothingness. According to this worldview, he entered into Sheol, the realm where the dead waited. But unlike every other soul that had gone before, he didn't enter as a captive. He stepped into death's territory, carrying the power of God's authority. That changes the whole story. If Jesus entered Sheol, it wasn't just to share the fate of all humanity, but to transform it from the inside. He entered the place everyone feared in order to rob it of its power. The ancient Jewish understanding of Sheol gives us a framework. It wasn't simply about fire and punishment. It was about a domain that held humanity in its grip. And if Jesus went there, then the descent wasn't defeat, it was invasion. On the cross, with his final breaths, Jesus spoke words that still echo through history. "Today, you will be with me in paradise." He said this to the thief who was crucified beside him, a man guilty of crimes, yet in his last moments placed his trust in Jesus. Those words raise a question that connects directly to the mystery we're exploring. What exactly did Jesus mean by paradise? In our modern minds, paradise usually means heaven itself, the place of God's throne, angels, and eternal joy. But in the language of Jesus' time, the word paradise often referred to a garden-like place of rest, an image borrowed from Eden. Many Jews believed that paradise was the section of Sheol where the righteous dead awaited the final resurrection. It wasn't the fullness of heaven yet, but it was a place of peace and comfort in God's presence. So when Jesus promised the thief, "Today, you will be with me in paradise," it didn't necessarily mean they were going straight to heaven in the way we imagine. It could mean they would be together in that place of rest, that safe side of Sheol, while the story of salvation continued to unfold. Think of it as a holding place where the faithful were kept, waiting for the Messiah to finish his work. This line shows that Jesus wasn't abandoned to nothingness. He wasn't lost in the void. Even in death, he was conscious, purposeful, and present with those who trusted in him. The thief's hope was secure because Jesus himself would be there. It also means that if Jesus entered the realm of the dead, he didn't do it alone. He brought others with him, even in that very moment of his death. The promise of paradise wasn't just comfort for a dying thief. It was a clue about what was happening beyond the cross. Jesus was stepping into the world of the dead, not as a victim, but as the one who could bring life, peace, and hope into a place that had never known it before. One of the most puzzling passages in the New Testament is found in the first letter of Peter. It says that after being put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit, Jesus went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah. This strange description has fueled debate for centuries. Who were these spirits? What prison was Peter talking about? And what exactly was Jesus proclaiming? Some believe the spirits are fallen angels, the rebellious beings who sinned before the flood and were locked away in chains of darkness. If that's true, then Jesus went to announce his victory over them, declaring that their power was broken once and for all. Others argue the spirits are the souls of people from Noah's generation, those who perished in the flood because they rejected God's warning. In this view, Jesus was proclaiming his triumph to them, not to offer a second chance, but to make clear that the judgment they faced was now final under his authority. What makes this verse so fascinating is that it shows Jesus wasn't passive after his death. He wasn't lying silent in the tomb. He was moving, proclaiming, making his victory known in unseen places. Whether to angels or to people, his message was the same. Sin, death, and rebellion had lost. He had won. The fact that Peter even mentions this moment suggests it was a vital part of the early Christian understanding of what happened between the cross and the resurrection. It wasn't enough that Jesus rose again. He had to confront the powers that held humanity in bondage. He had to enter their prison and declare that their walls could no longer hold authority over God's people. This passage leaves us with more questions than answers, but it pulls back the curtain just enough to show us that those hours in death were not wasted. Something active, powerful, and cosmic was unfolding. Jesus was not only Savior on the cross, he was herald and conqueror in the realm of the dead. Paul adds another layer to this mystery in his letter to the Ephesians. In chapter 4, he quotes from the Psalms, saying, "When he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men." Then Paul adds his own explanation. In saying, "He ascended," what does it mean? But that he had also descended into the lower parts of the earth. These words have sparked endless debate about what Paul really meant by the lower parts of the earth. Some read it literally, believing Paul was confirming the idea that Jesus descended into the underworld, the realm of the dead. Others interpret it as simply referring to his burial in the grave. He descended into the earth because his body was laid in the tomb. Still others think Paul meant something broader, that Jesus descended by coming down from heaven to live on earth in the first place. Each interpretation carries weight, but they each tell a very different story about what happened after the cross. If Paul was describing a descent into the grave, it emphasizes Jesus' full humanity. He didn't bypass death. He entered it completely, just as every person does. If Paul meant the underworld, then it's a picture of Jesus actively entering enemy territory, breaking chains, and leading captives out. And if Paul was speaking of his incarnation, then it highlights his humility, leaving glory to take on flesh and dwell with us. The beauty is that no matter how you interpret the phrase, all of them point to the same truth. Jesus went lower than anyone else, so he could raise us higher than we could ever reach. He stooped to the grave, to the underworld, even to the dust of our existence, so that none of us could ever say he didn't enter our reality. The descent was not weakness. It was proof that there is no depth too deep for him to go in order to save. Paul's words may remain mysterious, but they invite us to see the death of Jesus not as a pause in the story, but as the beginning of a movement downward that would only make his rising upward all the more glorious. The early church fathers wrestled with this question just as much as we do today, and their writings give us a glimpse of how the first generations of Christians imagined those hidden hours. For some, the descent into hell was not a minor footnote. but one of the most dramatic moments in the entire story of redemption. They spoke of it as the harrowing of hell, a phrase that means the breaking open, the plundering, the storming of death's domain. Irenaeus, one of the earliest Christian theologians, described Jesus as the one who went into the place of the dead to free those who had been held captive since the beginning of the world. Augustine, centuries later, taught that Jesus descended not to suffer, but to show his power, to declare his victory even in the depths. Origen imagined Christ's voice echoing into the underworld, shattering its silence with the announcement that the kingdom of God had come. This vision of the harrowing of hell captured the imagination of the church. Medieval art often pictured Jesus standing at the gates of a dark prison, pulling Adam and Eve out by the hand, with a trail of saints and prophets following behind him. The iron bars of the underworld are bent and broken. Keys are scattered on the ground, and the devil stands defeated, powerless to stop the flood of freedom. It was more than doctrine. It was a story that Christians saw as the climax of the gospel. The reason these early teachers spoke this way was simple. If death was the final enemy, then Jesus had to go through it fully. He couldn't just skirt around it. He had to march straight into its depths and emerge victorious. To them, this was the very heart of his triumph. The descent into hell wasn't a detour. It was a battlefield. And in that battlefield, Jesus didn't lose. He shattered the doors and led a parade of victory that the church would celebrate for centuries. But this raises a difficult question. If Jesus really did go to hell, what exactly did he do there? Did he continue to suffer after the cross? Was the agony of crucifixion not enough? For some, the idea of Jesus descending into hell stirs discomfort because it sounds like his work on the cross wasn't complete. Yet the truth is very different. The cross was the place of suffering. On it, Jesus bore the full weight of sin, shame, and judgment. When he cried out, "It is finished," he wasn't leaving something undone. He was declaring that the penalty had been paid in full. His descent into the realm of the dead was not to add to his suffering, but to display his victory. There's a world of difference between entering a prison as a condemned criminal and walking in as a conquering king. Jesus did not go into the depths as a victim. He went as the one holding authority. Think of it like a general walking into enemy territory after the war has already been won. The battle is finished, but now he comes to show the defeated enemy that their power is broken and their captives are free. That's the way many early Christians understood the descent. It wasn't weakness, it was strength. It wasn't punishment, it was proclamation. This matters because it shapes how we view our own salvation. If Jesus suffered in hell after the cross, it would imply his sacrifice wasn't enough. But if he went to proclaim victory, then we see the cross and the descent together as a two-part movement. First, he breaks sin's power. Then he announces to every corner of creation that death has lost its grip. The story isn't about Jesus being tormented in hellfire. It's about him walking into the place of shadows with the light of heaven blazing in his hands. That changes everything. It shows us that there is no darkness too deep, no prison too strong, no enemy too fierce for Jesus to overcome. He entered the worst place imaginable, not to suffer, but to make it clear that he had already won. If Jesus truly went into the realm of the dead, what does that mean for salvation itself? Some have wondered if his descent offered a second chance to those who had already died. Did he preach the gospel so that people who never heard it in life might believe in him after death? This idea has appeared in different Christian traditions, especially in the belief that Jesus liberated the righteous who had died before his coming. The thought is that Abraham, David, the prophets, and countless faithful people were waiting in Sheol for the Messiah to open the way into God's presence. When he arrived, the gates were thrown wide, and the faithful were led into glory. Others reject the idea of a second chance, arguing instead that Jesus' descent wasn't about offering salvation to the dead, but about declaring victory. In this view, the righteous were comforted by his arrival, but the unrighteous remained under judgment. The focus wasn't on conversion after death, but on the announcement that the work of redemption was finished, and death's hold was broken. This difference of interpretation has divided Christians for centuries. Catholic tradition emphasizes the limbo of the fathers, the idea that the saints of old were set free when Jesus descended. Many Protestants, however, stress that the descent was symbolic or limited to his burial, insisting that salvation is only offered during life. Both sides, however, agree on one key point. Whatever happened in those hidden hours, it confirmed that Jesus' work reached into the deepest places and left nothing untouched. And that's why this question matters for us today. If Jesus truly entered the realm of the dead, then he didn't just conquer sin on the cross. He confronted death itself and came out victorious. That means death is no longer a sealed door. For those who trust him, it's not the end of the story, but a passageway into life. The descent into hell, whether we see it as literal or symbolic, points us to the same unshakable truth. Jesus didn't leave any corner of creation outside the reach of his saving power. The Bible gives us a powerful image of what Jesus accomplished in those unseen hours. In the book of Revelation, Jesus declares, "I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive, forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades." Keys represent authority. To hold the keys of a place means you have complete control over it. For Jesus to say, he now holds the keys of death, and Hades is to declare that death no longer rules over humanity. He does. Think about what that means. For all of human history, death had been the ultimate master. No king, no prophet, no wise man, no warrior could escape its grip. Tombs filled every land, and Sheol waited for every soul. But when Jesus entered the domain of death, he wasn't just visiting, he was overthrowing. He broke through the gates that no one else could break, walked into the stronghold, and came back out carrying the keys in his hand. This is why Christians through the centuries have spoken of his descent as a battle. Not a battle of swords and shields, but a battle of authority. The enemy's greatest weapon was death itself, and Jesus disarmed it by dying and rising again. In that moment, death became like a locked door whose key now rests in his pocket. He decides who enters, and he decides who leaves. Imagine Jesus standing before the gates of Hades, not as a prisoner begging for release, but as a king demanding surrender. Chains fall, doors swing open, and the souls that had been waiting for redemption are led out in triumph. This isn't just poetic language, it's a vivid way of describing the spiritual reality that sin and death no longer have the final word. When we hear that he holds the keys, it reminds us that no grave is final, no darkness is permanent, and no enemy can outlast his authority. The unseen battle was not fought in vain. It was the moment when the greatest weapon of the enemy was taken from his hand and placed into the hands of the risen Christ. So why is it that so many modern Christians rarely talk about this part of the story? Why do sermons and Sunday school lessons often jump straight from the crucifixion to the resurrection as if nothing happened in between? Part of the reason is that the descent into hell is complicated. It's filled with mystery, strange verses, and centuries of debate. Pastors worry about confusing people or sparking arguments, so they often leave it alone. Another reason is that our culture doesn't like to sit with hard questions. We prefer simple answers, neat timelines, and a story that moves quickly from death to victory. Talking about Jesus going into the realm of the dead feels uncomfortable, even frightening. It challenges our neat categories of heaven above and hell below. It forces us to admit that the spiritual world is bigger and stranger than we imagine. There's also the problem of division. Different denominations read the same verses in very different ways. Some emphasize the harrowing of hell as a triumphal march. Others downplay it as nothing more than poetic language. Because Christians disagree, many churches prefer not to highlight it at all. But the danger is that by avoiding it, we lose a piece of the story that shows the full depth of what Jesus accomplished. If we ignore the descent, we risk seeing his death as just a pause button before the resurrection, instead of a cosmic act of victory that shook both heaven and hell. We miss the drama of him stepping into the very thing we fear most and breaking it from the inside. When we skip that, our picture of salvation can shrink, becoming only about forgiveness of sins and not about the defeat of every power that ever held humanity captive. The silence around this topic might make it seem unimportant, but in reality, it's one of the most important mysteries of the gospel. It invites us to look deeper, to wrestle with questions we can't fully answer, and to realize that Jesus' victory reaches far beyond what our eyes can see. The very fact that it unsettles us might be proof that it carries more weight than we've been taught to realize. But what if the whole idea of Jesus going to hell is misunderstood? Some theologians argue that when the Bible speaks of him descending, it doesn't mean he entered a fiery underworld at all. They say it simply means he went to the grave, the natural state of all who die. In this view, the phrase lower parts of the earth is another way of describing burial, not a journey into some hidden realm. This perspective focuses on the finality of his death. Jesus didn't avoid the fate of humanity. He experienced it fully. His body lay lifeless in the tomb, his breath gone, his heart still. That alone is profound, because it shows he entered the deepest weakness of human existence. He didn't hover above it. He didn't fake it. He actually died, just like we will one day. Others go even further, suggesting the line in the Apostles' Creed, "He descended into hell," was never meant to mean hell at all. They argue that the earliest versions of the Creed didn't include the phrase, and that it was added later to emphasize that Jesus truly died. In that sense, hell was just an Old English way of saying the grave. If that's correct, then much of the debate about what he did in the underworld might be built on a misunderstanding of words. This alternative view doesn't take away from the power of the story. Instead, it highlights the completeness of his death and resurrection. He truly entered the grave, but death could not hold him. He lay in the silence of the tomb, but on the third day he broke free. The descent, in this sense, was not about him storming into a fiery pit, but about him sharing in the fate of every human being, so that when he rose, he would rise on our behalf. This interpretation strips away the drama of the harrowing of hell, but it still leads to the same core truth. Jesus went as far down as death itself, and he rose again, proving that even the grave cannot separate us from God. Whether we see the descent as a literal invasion or as the silence of the tomb, the meaning is clear. Death no longer has the final word. At this point, we reach the heart of the mystery. Whether you see Jesus descending into a literal underworld or simply lying in the grave, the truth remains that something cosmic was unfolding in those hidden hours. The cross was not the end of the story, and the resurrection was not just a happy surprise. Between them was an unseen battle that secured the greatest victory in history. Imagine the silence of that Saturday. To the disciples, it looked like defeat. Their teacher was gone, his body sealed in stone, their hopes shattered. But in the unseen realm, the exact opposite was happening. Death thought it had swallowed him, but instead it was being torn apart from the inside. Hell's gates rattled, its chains snapped, its claim over humanity shattered. It was as if Jesus walked into the throne room of the enemy, declared his authority, and stripped him of his power. The resurrection on Sunday morning was the visible proof of what had already happened in the invisible world. When Jesus rose, he didn't just come back to life. He came back as the Lord of life. The grave could no longer hold him because he had already broken its lock. The stone wasn't rolled away so he could get out. It was rolled away so the world could see that he was already gone. This is the climax of the story. The descent, whether literal or symbolic, tells us that Jesus went as far down as anyone could go, deeper than any fear, darker than any sin, lower than any death. And from there, he rose higher than anyone could imagine. He turned the lowest point of human experience into the greatest triumph of God's love. That's why Paul could say, "Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your sting? Where, O grave, is your victory?" The sting is gone, the victory overturned. The unseen battle ended with a cry that still shakes the universe. Christ is risen, and death is defeated forever. When we step back and look at the bigger picture, two main views stand out. The first is that Jesus literally descended into the realm of the dead, confronted the powers of darkness, proclaimed his victory, and set the captives free. This view highlights the drama of the unseen battle, the moment when hell itself had to bow to the authority of the Son of God. It paints the descent as an invasion, a triumphal entry into enemy territory that ended with the gates being broken and the captives walking out behind him. The second view is that Jesus' descent was not into hell as we imagine it, but simply into the grave. In this understanding, he didn't preach to spirits or storm the gates of the underworld. Instead, he fully entered into death, sharing the fate of humanity, so that when he rose, he carried us with him. The focus here is less on a dramatic confrontation and more on the completeness of his death and the glory of his resurrection. Both interpretations come from the same desire, to honor the fullness of what Christ accomplished. And while they differ in the details, they meet at the same conclusion, that Jesus truly conquered death. He didn't halfway die, and he didn't partially rise. He went all the way down, and he came all the way up, bringing life and freedom to those who trust in him. What unites these views is more powerful than what separates them. Whether we imagine him storming through the gates of Hades or resting in the tomb until the dawn of resurrection, the truth is the same. Death could not hold him. The descent, however we interpret it, assures us that there is no place too dark, no pit too deep, no grave too final for Jesus to enter and redeem. This is the mystery and the beauty of the gospel. The unseen battle may never be fully explained, but its outcome is clear. Jesus lives, death is defeated, and eternal life is open to all who believe. The unseen battle of Jesus' death and resurrection isn't just an ancient story. It changes how we live right now. It means that no matter how dark life feels, no matter how final death looks, the victory has already been won. The cross shows us his love. The resurrection shows us his power. And the descent shows us that there is no place he won't go to rescue us. The question of whether he literally went to hell or simply to the grave will always stir debate. But the truth remains unshaken. Jesus has the keys, and nothing, not death, not sin, not fear, can separate us from him. If you want to dive even deeper, watch the next video on your screen right now.